On my birthday, my father gave me a tablet. 12 days later, the police took my brother away. What they discovered inside that device changed everything I believed about family, about trust, and about how well I actually knew the people I loved most in this world. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story I never wanted to tell. I'm a producer here at All of Revenge Stories, and what I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about elder care, about technology, and about the thin line between protection and predation. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to All of Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. My father, Richard Mitchell, was 72 years old when this all began. He lived in a modest suburban home in Rochester, New York, the same house where he and my mother raised my brother Christopher and me. It was a blue colonial on Maple Street with a wraparound porch and a garden my mother had spent 30 years cultivating. After my mother passed away 5 years ago, the house became quieter. My father maintained it meticulously, more out of habit than necessity. He would wake at 6 in the morning, make his coffee in the same percolator he'd used since 1995, read the physical newspaper at the kitchen table, and organize his day around his volunteer work at the local community center and his weekly poker games with friends he'd known for decades. Dad was old-fashioned. He still wrote checks. He had a flip phone that he barely used. He asked me to explain email attachments multiple times, even though I'd explained it dozens of times before. Technology made him uncomfortable, and honestly, he was fine with that. He said the world moved too fast already, and he had no intention of chasing it. My brother Christopher was 47 years old. He worked in cybersecurity for a major financial firm in Boston. He was brilliant, the kind of intelligent that made everyone around him feel a little bit inadequate. He could speak about encryption protocols and blockchain technology and zero-day vulnerabilities in a way that made my head spin. Christopher had always been driven, always been ambitious, always been the golden child in our family. He made excellent money, drove a Tesla, and talked about moving to California to start his own firm. But Christopher had a problem that nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. He had money problems. Massive money problems. He had a fiancée named Jennifer who loved expensive things. Jennifer had champagne tastes and she expected Christopher to deliver them. There were whispers about credit card debt, about a failed startup investment, about money borrowed from people you shouldn't borrow money from. My father didn't know the extent of it, but I knew. I'm a producer of true crime content, which means I notice things. I notice patterns. I notice when people's stories don't quite add up. I notice when someone's smile doesn't reach their eyes. I'd noticed all of this about my brother years before the tablet arrived. On Dad's 72nd birthday, in March of that year, Christopher showed up at the house with a beautifully wrapped box. Inside was an iPad Pro, the newest model, with a leather case and a stylus. Dad looked confused and delighted in equal measure. He said it was too much, that he didn't need it, that he wouldn't even know how to use it. Christopher laughed in that charming way he had and said, "Dad, it's time you joined the 21st century. I'll set it up for you. I'll teach you everything. Think of it as a bridge between you and the rest of us." I was there that day because I drove out from my apartment in Syracuse to celebrate. I remember watching Christopher set up the tablet. He moved quickly, efficiently, his fingers dancing across the screen. He created an email account, downloaded some apps, showed Dad how to access the newspaper online, how to video call his grandchildren, how to look up recipes. It all seemed so thoughtful. It all seemed so loving. Christopher insisted that Dad use only this tablet for his important things. He said, "Dad, I want you to keep all your banking stuff on here. Everything important. I can help you manage it remotely. That way if something goes wrong, I can fix it immediately. That way you're protected." Dad nodded and smiled. He trusted Christopher. Why wouldn't he? Christopher had always been the smart one, the capable one, the one who figured things out. I remember feeling a small flutter of something uncomfortable as I watched this happen, but I pushed it away. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was seeing conspiracy where there was only love. That was my first mistake. The first 2 weeks were normal. Dad sent his first email, a stuttering message to his brother in Florida that took him 45 minutes to compose. He called me via video chat, and I could see the wonder on his face, this new technology suddenly connecting him to people. He seemed genuinely happy, genuinely engaged with the world in a way he hadn't been since my mother died. Then the strange thing started. The battery would drain overnight, even though he wasn't using it. He'd wake up and find it at 5%, though he'd charged it to 100 and left it sitting on the nightstand. Dad mentioned this to Christopher, who said it was probably just a software update running in the background and that he'd look into it. Christopher said not to worry about it. Then Dad told me that Christopher had apparently helped him with his bank transfers, but Dad couldn't quite remember having discussed it. He said, "Maybe I'm just forgetting things. Maybe this is what getting old feels like." That was the second red flag, and again, I didn't want to see it clearly. I was busy with work. I was dealing with my own life. I wasn't living in Rochester anymore. I told myself it was none of my business, that my father was a grown man, that I shouldn't be suspicious of my own brother just because I worked in a field that had taught me to be cynical about human nature. Dad started mentioning conversations he'd had with Christopher, conversations that seemed odd. Christopher had apparently asked detailed questions about Dad's will, about his life insurance, about whether he'd changed the beneficiaries. Christopher had suggested that Dad set up a power of attorney, that he designate someone to make medical and financial decisions if Dad became incapacitated. All of this seemed logical, seemed smart, seemed like something a good son would suggest. But the way Dad described these conversations, they didn't feel like suggestions. They felt like investigations. On April 2nd, Dad called me. His voice sounded different, older somehow. He said, "Sarah, I think something's wrong. I tried to check my banking app this morning, and it said my password was wrong. But I know my password. I wrote it down in my notebook like Christopher told me to." I felt that flutter again, stronger this time. Asked him to read me the password. He did. It was his birthday followed by an asterisk and the number 3. It was the password he'd used for everything for the last 15 years. I asked him if he'd told anyone this password. There was a long pause. Well, Christopher helped me set it all up. He probably typed it in. My stomach twisted. I drove to Rochester that weekend. I didn't tell Christopher. I didn't tell my father exactly why I was coming. I just showed up on a Saturday morning and asked to see the tablet. My father handed it to me trustingly, and within 10 minutes, I knew something was very, very wrong. I took screenshots of everything suspicious. I downloaded copies of the suspicious applications. I created a backup. I called my friend David, who worked in IT, and asked him to come to my apartment as soon as possible. What David found made my blood run cold. The tablet had been modified. Someone had installed remote access software that allowed them to control it from another device. There were logs of activity that showed someone accessing the tablet at 2 and 3 in the morning at times when my father was sleeping. There was keylogging software that captured every single keystroke. There were credentials showing that my father's bank account had been accessed multiple times from an IP address that belonged to a commercial building in Boston. That was Christopher's office building. David looked at me with something like pity in his eyes and said, "Sarah, whoever set this up knew what they were doing. This is sophisticated. This is deliberate. This is not an accident." I sat on my couch and tried to process what I was being told. My brother, who I'd grown up with, who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd picked me up from my worst breakup and driven me around for 3 hours while I cried about a man who wasn't worth 5 minutes of my tears, my brother had installed spyware on my elderly father's device. He was monitoring him. He was stealing from him. I called my father. I drove back to Rochester. I told him everything. He cried. I'd never seen my father cry. He was a man from a generation that taught boys to keep their pain inside, to handle their problems alone, to suffer silently. But when I told him what Christopher had done, he cried like a child. He said, "Why would he do this? We have money." I would give him money if he asked. And that was the truth. My father would have given Christopher anything. All Christopher had to do was ask. But Christopher didn't want to ask.
Christopher wanted to take.
He wanted to take without the messiness of gratitude, without the burden of owing his father anything, without the humiliation of admitting that his fancy life in Boston was built on a foundation of debt and desperation. I called the police on a Tuesday evening in April. The officer who responded was a woman named Detective Lisa Hartley. She was in her 50s, I'd guess, with gray streaked through her dark hair and a no-nonsense attitude that I found immediately comforting. She listened to my story. She looked at David's technical analysis. She looked at the screenshots. She said, "This is elder abuse. This is fraud. This is identity theft. We're going to need to do a full investigation." The investigation took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, I learned that Christopher had been moving money from my father's account slowly, in amounts just under $10,000, to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements. He'd done this 17 times over the course of 4 months. That was $170,000. 17 deliberate, calculated withdrawals designed specifically to avoid detection. The police also discovered that Christopher had opened a line of credit using my father's identity. He'd taken out a home equity loan against my father's property. He'd applied for several credit cards. The total amount of fraud was somewhere around $450,000. When the police brought Christopher in for questioning, he almost immediately confessed. According to Detective Hartley, he broke down almost immediately. He said that Jennifer had been pressuring him. He said that his startup had failed and he'd lost a significant amount of money. He said that people he owed money to had been threatening him, that he'd felt desperate and trapped. He said that stealing from his father seemed like the only way out. He said he never meant for it to go this far. He said he was going to pay it back. He said a lot of things that don't matter now because actions are what matter. The thing is, this is the part where I should tell you that there was some big twist, some revelation that made everything make sense in a way that recontextualized the entire story. But there wasn't. This was just a story about a man who loved his father, who was desperate, who made terrible choices, and who had to face the consequences of those choices. On a warm day in early May, Christopher was arrested. The police came to his apartment in Boston with a warrant. He was let out in handcuffs. He was charged with identity theft, wire fraud, elder abuse, and theft. The prosecutor recommended he serve 18 months in prison. Christopher pled guilty. He made a statement to the court where he apologized to my father, where he cried, where he said he'd made a horrible mistake. My father sat in the courtroom and listened to his son apologize for stealing from him, and I watched my father age 10 years in the course of an hour. After the hearing, my father went home and, according to what he told me later, he sat in his bedroom for 6 hours and didn't move. He said he kept thinking about all the moments he missed seeing Christopher for who he really was. He kept thinking about the times he'd bragged about his son to his friends. He kept thinking about how he'd failed, somehow, to raise a son with better character. That wasn't true, of course. Christopher was an adult who made his own choices. My father wasn't responsible for those choices. But grief doesn't listen to logic. My father grieved the son he thought he had. He grieved the relationship they'd built on a foundation that turned out to be sand. He grieved his own naive trust. The house on Maple Street became a different place after that. My father had the tablet destroyed. He went back to his flip phone and his physical newspapers and his refusal to use technology. He said he'd learned his lesson about the modern world. He went back to his poker games, but his friends treated him differently. Word got around about what had happened, and there was a sort of pity in the way people looked at him, the way they spoke to him. He became the old man whose son stole from him. That became the story that defined him in his community. My mother's garden went untended. My father stopped leaving the house except for absolutely necessary errands. He stopped volunteering at the community center. He stopped calling me as frequently. He became smaller, somehow, more withdrawn, more cautious about the world.
Christopher served his time.
He was released after 16 months on good behavior. He moved to Florida to get away from the shame and the memories and the weight of what he'd done. My father and Christopher haven't spoken since the trial. My father says he doesn't know if he can ever forgive his son, and my brother says he understands that. They text occasionally, brief and cordial, but there's no real relationship there anymore. The damage was too extensive. The betrayal was too fundamental. Christopher had taken something from my father that was more valuable than money, more irreplaceable than property. He'd taken his father's ability to trust, his father's sense of security, his father's belief that the people you love will take care of you and not exploit you. I think about that day when Christopher gave my father the tablet. I think about the smile on my father's face. I think about how he said, "This is how we'll stay connected." And Christopher said, "Exactly, Dad. This is how I'll always be able to help you." Those words take on a different meaning now. He was always going to help himself. The story of the tablet became a turning point for me. I realized that the reason I work in true crime now, the reason I produce stories about deception and betrayal and the darkness that lives inside supposedly respectable people, is partly because I couldn't see the truth that was happening right in front of me. I missed the warning signs with my own brother. I missed the red flags because I didn't want to believe my family was capable of this kind of betrayal. I made excuses. I rationalized. I looked away. After that, I decided I would never look away again. I decided that the stories I tell would matter. I decided that if I could help even one person see a warning sign that I missed, then something good could come from my family's tragedy. And that's why I'm telling you this story today. That's why I produce content about elder abuse and fraud and family betrayal. Because my father was lucky in one way. He had a daughter who worked in true crime. He had a daughter who noticed when things didn't add up. He had a daughter who was paranoid enough to investigate. Most elderly people don't have that. Most elderly people trust the people around them, and that trust is beautiful, but it's also a vulnerability that predators exploit. If you have aging parents, if you have elderly relatives, please be vigilant about their technology. Please notice if they're asking strange questions about passwords and accounts. Please notice if they're becoming withdrawn or anxious about their finances. Please notice if someone close to them is taking unusual interest in their medical or legal affairs. These are the warning signs. These are the red flags I missed. Don't make my mistake. Don't look away. My father is 84 now. He lives in a senior community in Rochester. He's happy as someone can be after experiencing that kind of betrayal. He plays bridge with other residents. He volunteers at the community center again, though he's cautious about whom he trusts. He talks about my mother often, about the life they built together, about how grateful he is that she didn't have to see what happened with Christopher. He says that one of the gifts of getting older is understanding that you can't control other people, that all you can control is how you respond. He says he's chosen to respond with forgiveness, though not with reconciliation. He's chosen to keep living, to keep opening his heart, even though he was hurt in a way that would have crushed some people completely. His resilience amazes me. His grace amazes me. And his story is the reason I keep producing content for all of Revenge Stories. Because stories matter. Testimony matters. The truth matters. And sometimes the most important stories are the ones that happen to ordinary people in ordinary houses on ordinary streets. My father's story didn't make national news. There was no media circus. There was no documentary deal. But it changed everything for my family. It changed me. And if telling it here, if sharing it with you, if making sure that my father's experience means something beyond just our family's private pain, then I've done my job. Thank you for listening to my father's story. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult telling. Please, if you have not already, subscribe to all of Revenge Stories. Help me reach my mother's 1,000 subscriber goal and prove that these stories deserve to be heard. Comment below and tell me your own stories about family betrayal, about recognizing warning signs, about learning to trust again after trust was broken. These stories matter. You matter. And your voice adds to ours. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and this has been all of Revenge Stories.